Hi guys, my name is Chelsea Holden, and over the past semester I've been talking about and researching police brutality and police reform, more specifically police reform and why it's important. So we all are here living in America right now, and as people living in the United States, we know how heavily America relies on the police to keep our society running the way we're used to. But we've also all seen how devastating and how police brutality has shaken America over the past, I'd say, year and a half since last summer. I think we all really saw how terrible that was. Since our society runs so heavily dependent on the police, I think it's an unreasonable ask to defund the police completely or to completely get rid of them, because right now it's just not a feasible plan. But I am suggesting that we reform the police and how the police is run. The main goal for police officers is to keep people safe, but I think that there's better options to keep people safe than the police. We could take some of their money and give it to other people, and that's called reallocating resources, and it's a good way not to completely defund the police, but still become less reliant on them. Many officers do join the force to protect and serve, but there are people who join and end up abusing their power. So I think that the way we handle those police who abuse their power is a good way to reform the police, and change the way that we handle that. I think that sometimes people don't realize the severity of police brutality, but it's very real. And the effects that has on America are long-lasting. George Floyd was a victim of police brutality and he was murdered. And I think hearing from his daughter specifically really puts into perspective how devastating police brutality can be and how urgent it is that something is done to fix it. A lot of the times people call to defund the police, but they really mean reallocation of resources. Defunding means to completely take away the money that the police receive and get rid of the police altogether. Reallocating is, like I said, just taking some of the funds and moving them around, putting them elsewhere. I think that defunding is completely unreasonable right now, especially the way society works right now. But reallocating seems more like doable. Some examples of like ways people we could reallocate to are like specialist traffic control officers, community mediators, crisis response unit, maybe even self-policing within the community. But here in America, those are all ways that other countries have seen success with becoming less reliant on the police. But here in America specifically, I think we could take like DHS for us or other like foster and social programs, and take some of the social workers that work there and allow them to become like people we call. They can respond to things like familial disputes, noise complaints, things that aren't violent, because then they can go in with no weapons since they aren't trained to use a weapon. And that, I think, will definitely lessen the likelihood that it escalates to violence, because there's not the stigma around it of like possibly going to jail. It's just coming and figuring it out. And it can't escalate to police brutality because the police won't be involved in the first place. People tend to use the words reallocate and defund interchangeably, and I think that's very harmful to the conversation that I'm trying to have, because defund is so extreme and the immediate response is that police are necessary. Do you see how much they've helped? Which is true, they do help in some situations. So I think a way to progress the conversation further is to change the vocabulary and say reallocate if that's what you really mean. Many of the police officers, their core values is to help people. Their saying is protect and serve. So a lot of officers do join to protect and serve, but there are officers who join and end up abusing their power. And many of those who end up abusing their power repeat the abuse. It's not just a one and done. One of the most well-known offenders right now is Derek Chauvin. Repeat offenders is Derek Chauvin. He was a police officer who murdered George Floyd. He was the one who actually knelt on his neck and killed him. And he's infamous now for being a police officer and a murderer. Before George Floyd, Derek Chauvin had at least 22 complaints against him in the 19 years that he had been a police officer. If one of those complaints had been taken seriously, then we may be at a different situation right now, and George Floyd may still be alive, because 22 complaints is a lot of complaints to have in just 19 years. It's more than a complaint a year. So I think that if we reform the way that the complaints are dealt with in the beginning, before they boil over and a victim like George Floyd ends up dead, I think that would be very helpful. You could place the officer on probation, or you could send them to like a class, like a crisis response class or something like that, where they're able to handle the situations they're in better, especially if they have a track record of not being able to handle those situations. Police brutality is very, very real, and the victims are even more real. George Floyd is currently one of the most well-known victims. He was killed in 2020, and in his last moments he called out for his mom. She had died 2 years before his death. He wasn't the first victim of police brutality. There's been a lot of victims of police brutality before him, younger victims, older victims, everything. But his death was recorded as he was being murdered, and it spread like wildfire on social media. So almost everyone saw a man be killed and call out for his mom, which is really heartbreaking to see a grown man, crying for his mom, and he was telling the officers like he couldn't breathe, and they just didn't care, and it just showed how cold the officers were in that situation in his last moments. So it made everyone relate to it in a very personal way. Watching him cry out for his mom is something most people won't forget, including myself. The trial of the men who murdered him was also very publicized, so we know a lot about what happened in the courtroom and a lot about their history. During the trials of Derek Chauvin and the other officers, his daughter, who's only 7 years old, testified. And according to Alicia Lorenzo for NBC News, his daughter said, "I ask about him all the time. I ask, how did my dad get hurt?" Which is so heartbreaking for a 7-year-old to have had experienced. Hearing from the people who are directly affected by the police and police brutality makes it so much more heartbreaking. I think it makes the call for action even more urgent. Police brutality is a terrible abuse of power that's been going on for way too long, and now is the time to fix it.